Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julia Tulovsky. I'm head of Department of Nonconformist Art from the Soviet Union and Arts of Eurasia here at the Zimmerle Art Museum. And it is wonderful to have you with us here today for the program Bodies of Dissent, Performance Art in Armenia. This afternoon, we will explore key moments in Armenian performance art from 1970s to early 1990s. Many of the works you will see come from newly uncovered archives, offering a rare look at performances that have long remained behind the scenes. Today's program is presented alongside our exhibition, Topographies of Dissent, Armenian Art from the Dodge Collection. You will see a backdrop from this exhibition behind me. The exhibition will be on view through July 19. And if you have not visited yet, we warmly invite you to experience this show in person. And it was a joy to work on this exhibition with our guest curators from Yerevan, Lilith Sargsyan and Armen Yesayans. Today's talk is the final major program tied to the exhibition, but also like to acknowledge and thank our supporters, the Avenir Foundation Endowment Fund, the Dodge Charitable Trust, and Armenian General Benevolent Union for their informational sponsorship. Before we begin the talk, I also would like to make one announcement. On April 30 and May 1st, we will host an international academic conference celebrating the launch of our newly developed website dedicated to the Norton and Nancy Dodge collection of nonconformist art from the Soviet Union. The conference will bring together scholars from around the world and include sessions focusing on many regions of the former Soviet Union, including Armenia. Lilith Sargsyan and Armen Yesayans will also return to share their latest research on 20th century Armenian art. And we very much hope that you will join us, either in person or virtually. Please visit museum website to register for the event. So without further delay, it will be my pleasure and honor to introduce our today's speaker. Choghakate Kazarian is an art historian and curator specializing in modern, contemporary, and outsider art. She holds degrees in art history from École du Louvre, philosophy from La Sorbonne, and PhD from the Courtauld Institute of Art. A former curator at the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris and the pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, she has curated exhibitions on Lucio Fontana, Piero Manzoni, Karel Appel, and Henry Darger. Her recent projects include Immersion, Origins at Musée Cantonal des Beaux-Arts de Lausanne, Mood of the Moment at the Jewish Museum in New York, and the new matter, the Sergei Djavadian collection of Armenian abstraction at National Gallery of Armenia. After the talk, we will have a short Q&A session. Please type your questions at the Q&A window. And thank you once again for joining us. We are honored to offer today's program, Bodies of Dissent, Performance Art in Armenia. And with that, I give the floor to Choghakate.
Thank you, Yulia, for this beautiful introduction. It's quite exciting to be doing this discussion, especially considered how historically important this exhibition is, both for the understanding of Armenian contemporary art, but also in terms of collective practices, because I mean, it was not that such an easy thing to collect Armenian art in those years for different reasons. So that's why the title of my presentation, I'm going to share it right now. So I think you can all see the PowerPoint. So the title refers to the title of the exhibition, Topographies of Dissent. So why this use of dissent? Because it really kind of connects to the history of the Dutch collection as what they call non-conformist art, but also in a sense that is more directly connected to the a very specific nature of performance art in Armenia as a sort of medium of dissent. And this is more or less how it appeared, as a sort of intentional act of resistance and opposition, either as an institutional critique, but also with personal meanings, whether it takes place in a public setting or off the beaten tracks, as I will show shortly. Before I start, just wanted to say a few words why I decided to do this lecture screening is that there are so limited resources for Armenian performance art, because even though the genre is accepted, we still lack institutional recognition, and we don't have like a proper archive for performance, and archives in general, a problematic question for Armenian art. And the other problem has to do with the nature of performance, is that, well, if it's not documented, it's almost as if it never existed. So there was also a lack of documentation, and anybody who's worked on that knows that it's very hard to find visual evidence of those performances. And usually, especially in the Western world, we have artist estates, but this is not something that's developed in Armenia. It's slowly starting. I know the Armand Grigorian Archive just went to the Institute for Contemporary Art, so it will be taken care of, but the sort of family estates are not that organized. I would also like to say just a few words very briefly about what I mean by performance. So I would understand the word performance as a very, in its broader meaning, although related to the art world, not performance as theater. But some works that I may show might be not properly considered as performance, or more in the marginal forms that are more like performative actions or gestures. I know also the artists themselves don't necessarily use that word. They especially in the 80s, they used a lot the word happening, which was the word that was trendy since Alan Capro introduced it. But I would use the word performance more as a sort of general term to kind of encompass all those different gestures and terminologies for different reasons. First of all, because that's the word that is mostly used today, and happening tends to be used more in a historical sense. So it's not a study on performance as a theoretical genre, but more as a screening. And why I chose this is because this is something we all lack of. They've been, as you can see, in those limited resources I'm showing here in terms of bibliography, there are already a few articles about the performance in Armenia, but we just lack of that sort of historical overview on what happened, what's out there. So my purpose today is really to show as much as possible the performances done during that time frame of Soviet times, and just also to kind of, I hope, give the desire to many people, students, scholars, to go and study more and learn more. So I have gathered a lot of material, a lot of primary sources, some of them known, some of them unknown, and in order to clarify them, and I hope also a lot of people will show up and bring new information. And of course, there's always something very arbitrary about it, because as I said, it depends on what's available and what has been documented. So the first work I'm showing here is by the artist Hamlet Hovsepian, who was born in 1950 in the village of Ashnak. He's probably considered today the sort of father of contemporary Armenian art. And he had a quite intense activity, but more or less reclusive. And because he worked in his native village of Ashnak, but also due to his personality. But he gained recognition much later in the 90s and even 2000. And he worked in video, sculpture, painting, did also different ephemeral installations in open air. And what I'm showing is part of these videos he made in the mid-70s with 16 millimeter film. They're both considered as video experimental film, but also have a performative aspect to it. Like in this film, as you can see, the artist is just going around a rock in a repetitive gesture. And so this performance has to be linked to this series of small films he made that with the same meaning, but with different participants, about repetitive gestures, the sort of displaying eventless actions. And sort of, I think there's something almost anti-Sovietic about it because it goes against heroic action, historical event or importance. You can see a man itching his back, another one washing his head, yawning, a woman biting her nails. But these are more with the history of experimental film. I just want also to say a word that the chronology has been a little bit clarified by Ruben Arefshatian recently. It has been for a long time said that actually he made this film after returning from his stay in Moscow and sort of learned the avant-garde from the Moscow art scene, but it's not correct. Ruben Arefshatian clarified that actually he stayed in Moscow in the late 70s, so he made those films before going in Moscow. But most people didn't know about this video, and as far as I can understand, people started to kind of get knowledge of those films and performances much later in the 90s. Another important figure for early performance art is Grigor Khachatryan, who was born in 1952. He's really one of the most important. However, we don't have basically anything documented for those early years. So his later performances are documented, but for the early years, this is all we have. So he started this work in the mid-70s, Award of Grigor Khachatryan, where he's himself the award, and he's awarded to different personalities, friends or famous people. But most of what you see is just later because it's still an ongoing project. And Grigor Khachatryan invented this sort of artist ego, this persona filled with a lot of narcissism, but with always a lot of humor. And when I asked him about, aren't there any more documented performances? Because I know he was just performing basically every day from what I heard. But he said, nobody was recording at that time. And for him, performance was more sort of, it has always to do with humor, not taking life seriously. It was a really important part of his practice. This other project was called, it was actually sort of exhibition and performance called Happening, made by the initiative of Vartan Tovmasyan, Kiki, and Ruben Abovian, and they call themselves the Michukain Kentron, referring to the atom. So one day they decided to put together a provocative exhibition, and Tovmasyan exhibited his sculptures, Kiki showed his screens, while Vigen Tatibosyan showed a huge balloon. For the opening of the exhibition, there was a performance, very theatrical, with actors representing Salvador Dali and Picasso. There were ballerinas, a man wearing a gas mask, and various other participants. There was a poet called Belamuki, whose real name was Grigor Brutian, who was actually a physicist, but also an avant-garde poet, who recited his poem. Armand Grigorian remembered the poem as something like, quote, grandmother plus apple minus girl divided forest multiplied train plus steamboat minus pier plus house multiplied silence, end quote. And Armand Grigorian also said, who saw the performance, he said, to be honest, it was neither a happening nor a performance, but theater directed by the sculptor Vartan Tovmasyan. But there was several of these early performances had that sort of theatrical aspect to it. And what's also interesting to know is that the next day, the authorities closed the show, but the museum's, the director of the National Center of Aesthetics, Henry Darger, decided to simply overrule that decision and had the doors reopened. So kind of also shows his courage in those matters. So after seeing this, Armand Grigorian decided to do his own performance at the same place, the National Center for Aesthetics, created by Henry Darger. He was a very interesting, progressive place for education of through the arts. So you can see in this performance Armand Grigorian in the back, his eyes covered in black, the way they cover eyes in photos to make people unrecognizable. He was standing in front of the lectern, reading a text with absurd and surrealist tone made of newspaper headlines. And next to him, there was a person in a surgeon uniform. As remembered by Armand Grigorian, quote, in the back, Lucine Arakelian was sitting at the piano performing Beethoven's Appassionata. Which is funny because Karine Matsakian, when she told me about this whole thing, in her memories, it was a music more in the John Cage style. So interesting how different people remember differently. But only the part played by the left hand, while someone sitting next to her was pouring water from one bucket to another. Next to him, another was tuning his guitar when everyone was silent. Further back, two, one of whom was Gagik Vartanyan, were waving at each other every 5 seconds, like in a famous Dada play. When the music stopped, the surgeon and I was shouting and reading texts from the magazine Soviet Art, mixed with the political news of the day. So it was quite spontaneous, and in terms of how it was organized, because there was also some freedom left to the participants. Karine Matsakian, who's the woman sitting in front with the surgical mask, and she remembers that she was invited to participate in the performance, but since she was extremely shy, she decided to just sit there and look at the audience without any emotion or expression, a sort of existential absurdity. I think, as I was saying, all these kind of early performances had something very theatrical to it, but also it's sort of against the theater tradition of Stanislavski, more towards the surreal and the absurd. And so as Armand Grigorian remembered also, this is also where he sort of argument started with the director, Henry Darger, that followed the performance. According to Armand, Darger told him, our people don't need your experiment. And so it sort of started also this sort of tradition created later with the thoughtful group, sort of oppositional stance against the museum and the director, although several performances were made in that center, as well as in the museum, which was of which Darger was also the director. So I think things are much more complicated in terms of anti-institution, opposition, neglect, rejection, and so we just wanted to attract your attention to that. Another interesting performance of those early years has been made by Henry Darger, who is also from a very different generation of artists because he was born in 1936 in Tbilisi. So he comes from a different tradition, more the avant-garde Tbilisi art scene, where it studied theater and fine arts and worked for both. And he was interested in formal exploration of color, but he had also some performative gestures, especially during these perestroika years and even beyond. So this performance is dedicated to the Russian Armenian painter, George Yakulov, who was known to be also a sort of decorator who was involved in theater. So it was very much a theatrical performance. I highly recommend listening to Lily Tsarkisian podcast about his work. You can find it in the link I showed at the beginning for the RA Foundation, which is this attempt at creating an anthology of Armenian performance, which I highly recommend. Another performance by Henrik Elibekian was this idea, he's a painter. So the idea was to expand from painting into three-dimensional space. And so he painted on the clothes of a model, and then he asked them to move in a certain way, in a sort of mixing theater and painting, which are his two main interests. And just a word about where it happened. It was at this artist house in Jormala in Latvia, where he had a residency. It was a very progressive place, so he was able to do this experiment there. Another important figure of those early years, a future member of the third floor group, is Sev. he created a sort of persona for himself, and that's still the same persona until today. So he was always dressed in black, and actually his artistic name Sev means black in Armenian. You can see him here with his friend, the artist Kiki. In 89, when he gathered in the studio of the artist Armen Gevorkians with other third floor artists such as Sahak Bohosian, Amen Petrosyan, and Arahov Sepyan. They were just chatting informally, and then at that time, Sev had his signature long hair that he still has until today. And then Arahov Sepyan challenged him to shave his hair here and now, which actually they did. And then they suggested, well, now your bare head is a perfect canvas for a painting. So they suggested to draw something on it. So they did this very kitschy thing, like a graffiti with this heart, with an arrow. And you can see under the heart little drops of blood drawn in red. And then after doing this, they said, well, let's go to the Kazirok Cafe, which was the cafe where all the artists were gathering at that time. And so they walked down the Armenian street with Sev having that heart on his head. So it's sort of spontaneous performative gesture. Other things that are very exciting about Sev's practice is that even though he was not intentionally making self-conscious performances, he made several performative gestures that were unfortunately not always documented, except those. It was in the wasteland around Yerevan's thermal power plant, where he used to collect a lot of discarded pieces of metals, but also he used that place as a sort of outdoor studio to make his sculptures, because he was using a torch to melt all those toxic materials, would generate toxic fumes. So obviously, he cannot have an indoor studio, and still today, his studio is in the backyard of his home. And so he was used to make these sculptures out of discarded pieces of metal and plastic that he found in various junkyards, and he assembled them by burning them. And he did that also in his home outside, in his home in Daftashen. And some of these processes were photographically documented by Aram Urutian, who was at that time an amateur photographer who really loved this group of artists and documented a lot of those things many documents we have from that group, we owe them to Aram Urutian's documentation. And Sev really liked to he said, when I asked him, why did you have these photographs taken? He said, Aram was interested in spending time with me, photographing me, and I was interested in that because I don't like to explain my work, but I would rather show the process instead. So this sort of performative gesture that consists of performing the creative process. And what is also interesting is that in those perestroika years, a lot happened in the sort of not mainstream places, either the Yerevan State Conservatory, the Aesthetic Center, and also outdoor spaces. One of those very important places preceding the third floor group was this place in the center of the city where now you have Marti Rosarian's statue, but at that time the place was still empty, so they were waiting for the statue. And in 86, three artists started gathering there, Sev, Flog, and Ashot, they used it as a sort of outdoor space to show their works. So they were standing there speaking with people who were coming there, but also sort of spontaneous performative gestures appeared. Few of them were documented. And this was a really key place for this early years of the Armenian contemporary art. So on the left, you can see Sev holding an umbrella with Flog, although it doesn't rain. But he always had that umbrella with him, and we'll see later in a different performance where he holds the umbrella indoors, so it was almost part of his persona and his outfit. To the right, it was a photography of a gesture suggested by the photographer Zaven Hachikian, and you can see Sev holding one of his sculpture that looks like a saxophone with his foot inside that basin where there's no water, and he wouldn't be washing his feet anyway because he still has his socks on. So this kind of image that plays with this sort of absurd situation. As I said, so the kind of real jump into contemporary art It's usually considered this exhibition in 87 with the first exhibition of what would be later called the third floor group that Angela Harutyunyan calls, I quote, the first large artistic cultural movement of non-official artists in Armenia, end quote. So it was a sort of started within the discussion with the youth division of the union that allowed them to obtain an exhibition at the artists union, although they were not members of the union necessarily, but they didn't give them the proper exhibition space, but the auditorium on the third floor, which will give them their name. So the exhibition that lasted about a week was not just an exhibition, but also a pluridisciplinary festival with an event every night with music, poetry, breakdance. As you can see to the right, this event of breakdance has been photographed. And on the left, you can see the banner for the exhibition, and to the right, there's like a list of all the events for each evening. Armand Grigorian, who was behind all this, remembered, I quote, there were daily discussions related to different fields such as painting, literature, cinema, alternative jazz, punk, rock, minimalist music, and one day was devoted to mass media. The idea was also to go beyond this medium specificity that was so important to the organization of the artists union. And so it kind of connects to their interest in performative practices. Their interest in performance was also due to the fact that it was an unmediated form of communication with the audience, something more horizontal and something that appeared anti-hierarchical as a medium. So the next year, the group decided to organize a performance, which is probably the most famous performance in Armenian history, and properly a performance as institutional critique. On October 23, just looking at the time we have, yes. So on October 23, 1988, the opening of Yerevan's official autumn exhibition was interrupted by a silent procession. A cohort of young artists costumed as the living dead glided through the galleries and exited without a word. The action made a blunt statement. Since the official art sanctioned by the artists' union belonged to the past and was therefore dead, its proper audience could only be zombies. The intervention has since become a seminal milestone in the history of Armenian performance. Due to recent uncovery of some archive, we have a few pictures of the way that the artists get prepared for the performance. So they had keys to the offices of the union's youth section, although it was a sort of non-programmed performance. They really crushed it, the opening of this official exhibition, but they had somehow access to these offices of the youth section. So you can see them here on the left, Karine Matsakian, creating her outfit all white as a ghost and vampire, putting on socks. The photo below, you can see Ashot asking someone to hold his jacket where he had written Nature Morte, putting some flour on it because it's a material he always uses. And to the right, the artist just putting on makeup on. We can see Vahan Rumelian to the left. I find it's interesting to have this color photograph to see that. And so for this unofficial performance that was initiated by Armand Grigorian and Kiki, each artist offered a personal vision of the living dead. Karine Matsakian was a livid vampire. Kiki was a dead soldier. Sev was his unusual, dark, shadowy figure. And Ashot proposed a more conceptual approach by writing Nature Morte on his back. Well, and in the same way, Armand Grigorian was carrying this board on him. You can see on the picture on to the left, where it was written the Netherworld, while other adopted makeup inspired by rock bands. You can see here. So the idea was really to have, the only instruction they had was to walk silently to the exhibition hall and have no eye contact, no discussion with the audience. So after they finished that, they just gathered in the same offices where they get dressed. And so they just lingered to pose for photographs. So there's also another aspect to that, which is more properly photographic, as you can see here. And they were just fooling around, celebrating their courageous gesture. There's also a recently uncovered film of that performance. You can see here when they're exiting the office in order to enter the proper exhibition space. And for this artist, really, the idea of the performance was a sort of disruptive language. They used performance to disrupt this official dead exhibition. It was both provocative and had that direct impact. So this idea of the netherworld was a sort of metaphor that operated in two directions, both as a burial ground for exhausted official styles and retrospectively as a reflection of the group's own underground position as artists either excluded from or relegated to the periphery of the sanctioned cultural sphere. And in a certain sense, this performance was also very important historically. It was just a month before the earthquake, and a few months later, they had officially access to the union's exhibition hall. So it also shows a sort of change in the symptom. So the performance involved about 20 participants, including Aishot Ashot, Arman Grigoryan, Kamo Grigoryan, Vartan Harutyunyan, Boris Kazarian, Haikuhi Kazarian, Kiki, Karine Matsakyan, Karo Mokarchan, Stepan Panosyan, Vahan Rumelian, Sev, Vartan Vartanyan, and many others who was just friends. Unfortunately, we cannot identify because we only know them by first names, but if you identify anybody, please let me know. The year after that, during an exhibition at the Modern Art Museum in Yerevan, Sahak Pohosyan participated with the performance. And so when Pohosyan proposed the idea of a performance to the museum's director, Henry Higitian, the director said, okay, but one condition, no holes on the wall. So Sahak Pohosyan decided, because he needed some empty canvases, some canvases to be painted on. So, but he had the instruction to do no holes. So he decided to suspend the canvases as you would do with laundry. And so he used stones to weigh them down. So you can see it looks like an installation, but it was the result of all those technical conditions. So the performance was started on the opening day. The idea was that he took on the cliche of modern art, the idea that anybody can do what they're doing. So he decided to say, okay, if anybody can do abstract art or modern art, then let's do it. So the performance was called Draw Your Favorite Pictures. And so the audience was invited to do the paintings themselves. Here you can see on this picture, actually, to the left, the director of the museum, Henrik Egitian, and here on the front, it's the artist Offenbach with his daughter on his shoulders, just participating to the performance. So the idea was like everybody can participate. And here you can see the artist with his shirt stained with painting and his signature, talking to the museum director. So everybody painted during that opening, and later, because it lasted a week, so the next days also the audience had the possibility to paint. So, but the artist was the only one who actually didn't paint anything. During that same exhibition in a different room, another artist from the third floor group, Aishot presented his performance. He's probably the member of the group that was the most active in performance. He really made a recurring use of that medium. It was probably one of his favorites. So when visitors entered the room, they could see him lying in a bed with all sorts of domestic stuff under the bed. So the idea was kind of to disrupt the public sphere of the museum by bringing the intimacy of a bed. And at some point during the performance, a woman came in and joined him in the bed. Then he left the bed, and then another man came in to join that woman. And then just everybody invaded the bed. The impression of intimacy was reinforced by the canvas of an amateur painter that you can see on the wall, who was made by Vasile, a Sunday painter that would exhibit outdoors at the placement of the Dissarian monument. And you can see here, children found that very fun and started playing with all those domestic items under the bed. and then everybody just came in for a final photo shoot. The idea was really also to show that sort of intimacy as something hidden, but also turn into something that can be watched by everybody. And also, what does it mean for an artist to have a private life? Is it public persona or not? And the performance survived throughout the exhibition as an installation with just the bed. The year after that, for the first official exhibition of the third floor at the artist exhibition space, so Ashot did this performance called The Structure of Communication, which is probably one of the most famous performances and in Armenian history for those years, as a very spectacular event. During the opening of the exhibition, visitors encountered a woman bound to the floor by white fabric bands, radiating outward like the spokes of a web, pinning her to the ground. Over the course of the performance, Ashot gradually freed the model by cutting the ties. The severed fabrics fell around her like rays, which he then covered with flour, an element that would recur throughout his work. And the performance articulates an existential proposition: the attachment of the ego and the social constraints through which individual identity is obscured, and the necessity of liberation from them. By cutting the ties, Ashot severs attachments both physically and mentally, then uses the flower to soothe the wound of separation. So it was more here, the critic is not so much against the institution, but more sort of form of dissent against society in general, but with an existential tone. Then at the end, he just signed his name on the floor covered with flower, which will stay sort of as an ephemeral installation throughout the exhibition. And the audience carried the flower with them, dispersing it throughout their footsteps. As I said, he was very familiar with performance in general, and it has been probably nourished by his participation in the Annikshay Festival of Performances in Lithuania in 88 and 89, which was a very exciting and progressive festival. And actually, which is interesting, I mean, there's a lot to say about the relationship between Baltic countries and Armenia, but his participation was entirely by chance, because in 88 he was in Panevėžys for a solo show. He heard about the festival. He decided to show up there with his friend, the artist Vahan Rumelian, who's another artist from the third floor group. He was there with him. And by chance, they ended up in Annikshay and participated in that performance. And they were invited again the year after in 89. So there, among all the performances he made, so it was a festival of outdoor performances organized by composers. So I think that's kind of interesting in a sort of Fluxus-inspired spirit. In this performance, Ashot tied the participant with threads, painted lines on their legs. And so every time they were trying to move, bring closer, so they were more and more turning around with these threads and just getting together more. He did another performance there with a pig on which he wrote his name. And so he was interacted with this pig, trying to kiss and hug the pig. And the idea, it's called megalomania. The idea was that we only love ourselves and we see ourselves in the mirror of ourselves. What we see in others is a sort of mirror of ourselves. He liked this kind of provocative gestures, and there were many other performances done in Annikshay that were unfortunately not documented. A student from the Courtauld Institute, Rachel Tulburn, recently wrote a master thesis about Ashot's participation in the Annikshay Festival. I'm showing you this video. It was done by other artists, Lithuanian artists, but you can see here Ashot participating, because the idea of just to explain the idea of this performance was that everybody was doing their own performance, but also participated in each other's performances as well. And you can see here Ashot with this other Lithuanian artist. So, but I'm not going to linger on that. So in 1990, in the village of Arates, Ashot organized this performance where the audience is sitting here, they're outdoors, just staring at the landscape as if it was a theatrical event. So just to give you a sense of the context, it was made in the abandoned village of Arates, who was known for its medieval ruins. And so he organized a festival of outdoor performances with students from various schools and friends. He brought his wife, his children. And at that time, he was teaching at the Machitar Sebastati school, which was this extremely experimental and progressive school, both from an artistic, educational, and political point of view. And during the Karabakh War, the village of Arates was evacuated and the houses were abandoned. And so the school was in charge of using the village for educational purposes. And it's still going on and very developed. But in those early days, basically it was still in ruins and the teachers were using these abandoned houses for different purposes. And so he gathered different people and brought them there to spend a week to just teach them performance. It was really part of his role as an educator and professor at the Machitar Sebastati school, although it was entirely not part of the program of the school, but he used it for educational purposes to teach younger artists how to make performance. Another performance he made there is this one. So the performance stages the burial of a plaster copy of an antique head. And then a few days later, they're unearthed to look at the effects of time on it. So that's the artist digging a hole to bury that sort of, there is both a sort of iconoclastic gesture of burial of ancient culture leading to potential tabula rasa, but there's also the idea of sort of giving sense to meaningless object because it's just a cheap plaster cast. But somehow, while time passing, it sort of gives a sense of patina. This is the artist's son just coming here, but so it was all done in a very intimate environment, people coming in, participating, covering the head. So during this week of performance, there was also a performance related to body art, but we may call that like that. So he used a stencil to paint different signs on the participants' bodies. Crosses, triangles, hearts, lines, circles, very repetitive patterns that were also something he was using in his own works. At that time, a lot of the patterns of his paintings had to do with repetition of very basic signs. When he remembered about the specific... reverse so, you know, when they were painting on this, there was I don't know if you can hear well. I don't know if you could hear me through the sound of the video, but so as I was saying, he was painting on the participant's body with different signs, very basic signs like crosses, triangles, hearts, circles, and lines, which corresponded to what he was doing also in his work as a painter at the same time, using repetitive gestures with these basic signs. After that, they went to the river to just wash. So just also a word on why we have the chance to have this material. It's because the artist was able to borrow a camera from the school, or a VHS camera. The school, as I said, was a very progressive school at so many levels, also in terms of technical material available. It had also computers and VHS cameras. So the fact that we have this rare documentation for those years, it's that because he borrowed that camera from the school and he filmed the whole week of performances mixed with everyday life. And I mean, I can't show you everything, but another performance from that seminar was this one. The words are written on various things that they designate, giving a sort of tautological note for this performance, typical of conceptual art. So the performer you can see here is Zek. That's how they call him. He was a science student at that time. He was close to Ashot, who acted as a mentor to him. They did a lot of work together. They did a number of eyesore together issue. And he's also the main actor of the big experimental film that Ashot did called The Angel Gabrielle, part of which were also filmed in Anates. As I said, the idea was also to work with different people, students or artists to teach them how to make performance. So everybody who came up with an idea, Ashot would guide them on how to turn this into a performance. And this seminar was the sort of educational purpose. Like this one because it's written God in Armenian on the walls of this old medieval church. And here it's written Haikuhi, which is the name of the artist's wife, and the art on and so we can hear Ashot giving corrections to Zeg to how to perform while he's filmed. Fortunately, I have to move forward because we don't have a lot of time left. So these are the views of the exhibition plus minus, an exhibition organized by the Third Floor group. Who had just exhibited in Paris in '89, and after the Paris exhibition, a lot of aesthetic differences emerged between the group. And these debates reflected in their next show, which was the Plus Minus in 1990. And so where the eclectic mix of the previous exhibition is now replaced by a strict separation between the two dominant styles of the group, which is pop on one side and abstract minimal on the other side, which you can see here. So on the left, it's the first floor of the exhibition. So it's all what we call the pop tendency. of the group, and on the right, it's the more minimal abstract aspect that was led by Kiki, while the pop group was more led by Armand Grigorian. Actually, what is interesting here is how this sort of aesthetic differences visible in the curation of the exhibition were also performed by the artists themselves in the way they fashioned themselves. On the left, you can see Armand Grigorian with a leather jacket with the word Vandal written on it, and this reverse cross because it was very much inspired by heavy metal groups. And on the right, actually, the abstract group decided that actually to kind of go against that sort of pop rock identity and to actually wear suits with bow ties to kind of show the sort of solemnity of their work, but also in a very ironical way. And you can see it especially in the way that Sev, who is just on the left of the photograph, interpreted that because, well, he was always dressed in black, so he couldn't have a black bow tie, so he wore a white bow tie. And during that show also, they decided to kind of, as Armand Grigorian remembered, I quote, in order to emphasize the stylistic differences, we did a photo performance in the garbage dump in the backyard of the Artists' Union. The pop artists argued with Kiki and Armen Hadjian, who were the abstract artists, end quote. Others remember it as a simple photo shoot in the backyard of the Artists' Union near the garbage. The idea was a kind of to show the garbage either associated with what was shown at the Artists' Union in general or more associated with the plus group, depending on how artists remembered it. The idea was like really self-fashioned and made a statement, a sort of performative statement. Just one last important performer of that time was Azad Sargsyan, who would also become very famous with his performances in the late 90s. So in the ruins of an old bookstore at the corner of Aram and Abiovian Street, he decided to make a series of performances that you can see here. So the public and the journalists were invited really to see the performance. So as I said, a lot of early works I've shown you, they're more on the edge of performance, more connected to video or creative process. But this was really staged as a proper performance. The highlight of that was actually the end of the evening when, after doing his performances, Azad sat on this abandoned toilet wearing a suit and sunglasses and decided to give interviews to the journalists speaking about his work. So he's a very important figure of those years because he really did a more self-conscious and properly staged performance on its own. Since time is running, I'm going to jump to the conclusion. So with this work that he did for a later exhibition where he appeared.
Այս ինչ որ ես իմ վիճակը որպես էքսպոնատ, սա այսպես կարելի ասել, ինչպես փոխանցել, այսինքն կարելի է դնել վերնագիր կամ կոնցեպտը փոքր, մի քանի բառով ասում, ինչպես փոխանցել մաքսիմում սուբյեկտիվության հասնող օբյեկտիվ փորձը.
Basically, in this video, where he was interviewed during the opening of the exhibition, he said, like, he's the exhibition himself, he's the exponat, as he explains, and to have this direct interaction and shows himself. During the same exhibition, he did another performance where he created a circle and to conclude this I just decided to finish this created by Leslian and because their performance at the very what has been created that we will show more developed later in the mid-90s with the ACT group, and there was a strong development of performance in the late 90s. I'm going to finish here to leave some time for Q&A, comments, or if anybody has more information. And so, as I said, this choice is arbitrary, depends on what can be found material. And I hope more things will just come out, especially regarding participation of women artists and other artists. And if you have any archive, please let me know. I hope this is just the beginning of a larger and deeper study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Choghakate, for such a wonderful and insightful and informative talk. Now we have time for a Q&A, and I have quite a few questions myself, but maybe I will start with the audience and intervene mine as we go. So one of the questions follows up on the videos that you showed of Ashot performances. And the question is, did Ashot envision showing the film taking of this performance art or at some point, or was it to document for the archival purposes mostly?
So I don't think he had a very much a sense of archive. I think most artists don't. I mean, some do, but especially that generation really didn't. I think why he filmed, first of all, he had the possibility because he could borrow this camera from the school where he was teaching. So he had that possibility to have that VHS cassette. So the idea to film was also to bring that to the school for educational purposes. However, I'm not sure it happened. If it did, maybe one time, but this is something that nobody knows about. I don't think so. And because it's VHS, then after a few years, obviously everybody has trashed their VHS recorders. So it also kind of, and I had it digitalized recently and a few years ago. So, but no, unfortunately, no, not archival purpose. I think it was mostly for educational purposes first, although the idea was also to do another seminar, but it didn't happen or was not recorded.
Another question that we have is that were there women artists in Armenian performance art? Because mostly the women that were shown with either models or participants of the performance. Yes.
That's a very big question I asked myself through that when I was preparing this this lecture. So many of them there are many Armenian artists who did performance, but they come later. They start from the late 90s. Unfortunately, I was not able to find anything so far. I mean, I had one path to explore. Unfortunately, the artist was not available to speak to me before today. But yes, so we had Karine Matsakian, who was an important member of the third floor group. She participated more as a participant, not as an initiated author properly, as in Arman Grigoryan's performance Exit to the City, was where the author is Arman. For the collective performance of The Living Dead, so the initiative was taken by Kiki Arman Grigoryan. However, they consider as all participants as authors. So it's very much collective authorship. For other cases, like with Ashot, yes, it was more like models or students, but so far I haven't found, but I hope things will just come up. I mean, I have a few ideas why there's so little women. I mean, this is, if someone is interested, we can continue the discussion. But yes, I did look into that. Unfortunately, nothing came up or not clear enough to show you today.
And you mentioned that the talk is based on the material that was recently uncovered. And can you talk a little bit about, the availability of this material, how it lived from the point of when it was taken and until now, and what is the state of the scholarship on performance art in Armenia? Because this is something, as I understand, very unique and so far little studied.
So as I showed at the beginning about some attempts at archival some sources, so Angela Harutyunyan did some work on performance that was really part of her general work of that period in Armenia. The biggest attempt was by Marine Karoyan, I put the link to the RA Foundation to kind of create a sort of anthology for Armenian art. But as you can see, I mean, there's a lot that is more about later period, but for the Soviet time, we have very little information yet. So this is more or less so far what we have. And she also did a lot of podcasts that you can find on the same link. She interviewed different people like Lili Sargsyan, but also artists about the performances they made. So it's still very, I mean, they're just little pieces here and there. I just hope that, first of all, artist estates will be created for artists who are dead and material will be digitalized, but that's another issue also. Like, as I was saying, the Arate seminar by Aishot somehow it was physically accessible, although it was not shown in the 90s because it was a VHS, then nobody could access that. And then when I digitalized, oh, okay, now we have access and it can be shown again. But usually, yes, we have to take into consideration that some things were done at a certain moment doesn't mean they were shown. Like Hamlet Hovsepian's films, they were, I mean, other artists told me, you know, we only heard about these movies in the 90s and not before, although they were made in the mid 70s.
And the question from the audience, how do performances and documents tie in with the queerness in Armenia at that time?
It's very hard to answer because there are very little studies done on the subject generally. I mean, gender studies in general are something very trendy. They have appeared in Armenia, but they're very recent and they concern mostly very contemporary art. So no studies have been done on that period, but I hope someone will look into that. But as I said, it's hard to study from that angle as long as we don't know what's out there. So my impulse today was really to do this kind of work to say, let's try to figure out what's out there and then we can look at it and then identify things like queerness and I don't know, other subject that may emerge now that we have this small outline of what's out there.
So another question is, were these artists criticized by their fellow artists who were following traditional paths of performance and the public? So were they criticized? How they were received by the public and
There were different reactions for some of the performances where I've worked more closely as the Living Dead, the collective performance of the third group in '88. I did long interviews with all the artists I could find. So I've also asked them questions about reactions. So for this performance, I know a little bit more, although it's from their point of view. So they said they had different reactions. So most of the reactions were just they didn't understand what that was. Were they a theater group? Was it part of the official programming or not? It was unclear for a lot of people. Some people also thought it was a sort of homage to the Somgait dead because they had that tragedy just before, because, you know, they were like dead people. So I think there was a lot of misunderstanding. For the '82 performance called Happening that I showed earlier. So as I said, the authorities closed that show the next day, although Igitian decided to reopen it. So there were different reactions, but we have also to bear in mind that it was the Perestroika years. So the audience was slightly more open, but a lot of misunderstanding, of course. But and for the Arates and what Sev did, for instance, it was very intimate, so they were not properly an audience, except people who were participating. So a lot of these performances happen in a very closed environment and not with a larger audience.
In answering the question from the audience, this lecture is recorded and will be available online through probably on our YouTube channel eventually. So I have another question. Basically, you showed the first video was by Hamlet Hovsepian. That's the name, yes. And so it was very early in 70s, right? Would you remind 70?
76 or 75.
76 and 75. I think those were wonderful videos. So basically the earliest performance art is in Armenia is mid-70s, right? And so my question is, what did he put in, what kind of meanings did he put in these short action videos? Because they somewhat remind me of the videos taken by Andy Warhol that we have now on view in our museum. He filmed his models and people who come into his studio, asking them to stare into the camera for a couple of minutes, doing nothing. But then, of course, they started to engage in certain activities. So there is this parallel, and I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And basically, also, I'm interested in the kind of context in the sources where Armenian artists learned about the performance genre in contemporary art and how this connection was happening.
So regarding Hamlet Hovsepian, I can't tell for sure exactly if he knew about Warhol's films. I mean, they had access to books, clearly were highly educated, although not necessarily to the official education, but they had access to books. And, you know, especially at some point when they had access to Xerox, I mean, all those books was Xerox. So it was, well, also to keep in mind, most of the images they saw were black and white and quite likely Xerox, so not high quality. So, but books and photocopies were circulating for sure. All the artists told me about it. They were quite aware of what was happening in the West. I don't know if they have physical access to videos. I highly doubt that because I don't know how they would see them unless it's shown on TV, which I'm not sure, especially in the 70s. In the 80s, in addition to books and magazines, they were also, for those who were regularly going to Moscow in the late 80s, there were also some exhibitions of Western art. For instance, the Lenz Schoenberg collection was shown in the late 80s. Some works by Rauschenberg, Günther Uecker were shown. So there were some more direct contact at that time, but it was mostly, as far as I know, although they had good knowledge of Western art, but mostly through books.
Yes, I'm not, mentioning Warhol. I'm just talking about parallels because these videos were not really for presentation. It was mostly for his archive. So we just recently kind of started to work with them and make them public. But also, a shot performance Intimacy has parallels with some of Marina Abramovich's works. So
I don't know how much he knew at that time. It's unclear. I mean, he knew about performance, but I'm not sure that he had direct connection with Marina Abramovich in general. I think his interest in performance has two roots. One, I think that comes from the theater world because very early, his first actual paid job was at Henry Gigitian's Center for Aesthetics, where he was teaching experimental theater. And before teaching himself, he worked for a very famous experimental theater director. So I think that we have to keep in mind that there's all this part connected to the theater world. And then the other aspect is that I think it has to do with his general interest in how art is just fully part of life. In the interview he made for the RA Foundation, actually he explains that basically for him, there's no difference when he's actually making art or just cooking or just building his home. So there was also this kind of idea of more, although some of his performances are really probably staged in a museum in exhibition space, but for him there's no difference. So it's and I've shown only pieces from the Arates seminar, but if you watch the whole footage, you can see like it's all mixed in there. A little bit you can see in the videos that there's someone eating a sandwich and coming and participating to the performance, coming out. So it's much more mixed. I don't think that there's a specific artist performer who was, I mean, there were many artists he was interested in, but they were mostly painters. As far as I know, I don't think there was someone in the performance world that kind of caught his attention. His idols were mostly painters.
And what is the current situation in the future of performative art, performance art in Armenia? What's going on now? If there was this tradition that was planted in 70s and 80s has any kind of continuation, if you know, in the present day?
As far as I know, from the late 90s, it has highly developed and is regularly practiced. And well, there are a lot of women who are extremely present in that medium. Although I'm pretty sure there were some women before. It's just we don't know about them. I couldn't find any or nothing or things that were too blurry to show. But so yes, I would say it's still extremely present, accepted, and I mean it is now since then I think in the late 90s.
And also you mentioned participation of Ashot Ashot in a Latvian performance festival. So I was wondering about this kind of horizontal ties between artists from different countries and parts, because it was Soviet Union was a very centralized system with very restrictive information, yet people did develop this connections and cultural ties. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
As I said, it's not a research field, but I feel like there's some connections. Well, first of all, Baltic countries and Caucasian countries, well, they're small republics in the periphery of the sort of Soviet Empire. Clearly, probably they had more freedom to experiment or anything. But there's a connection with the Baltic countries because a year before the Anikshai Festival, there was this huge inter-Soviet festival in Narva, and a few Armenian artists actually participated there. So far, no performance has been recorded, although I spoke with a couple of artists that said they did. For instance, Sev apparently did a performance there, but it hasn't been documented. But Narva is now a little bit more studied. So I think I'm waiting for someone to study that connection with Baltic countries. For instance, in a different field, there was this early collector, Friedemann Stöckert, I think, who collected more or less at the same time as Dodge, was this German, I think he was producing medical instruments or something and selling them in the Soviet Union, and he was paid in exchange with artworks. So, but it's not as studied as the Dutch collection. And so it's surprising when you look at his works. Of course, he has artists from Russia, but he has an expectantly high number of works from Caucasian countries and Baltic countries. So there's also some another connection here I haven't explored. But as far as I know, the connection really happened by chance, more or less. Oh, yeah, there was Henrik Elibekiano, so he was invited in Latvia and did that. So I'm starting to notice a lot of connections, but it's just emerging. We need to just see what's behind that, if there's a pattern.
Oh, I think that's a very, very interesting and understudied field, which hopefully will uncover more and more materials in this respect. And there's another question from the audience. In your research, did you find anything that might show that the artist may have deliberately avoided documentation, maybe to protect the ephemerality or to keep it alive?
I haven't noticed any intentional act of non-documentation. I've noticed two things. First of all, they didn't have cameras at hand. So that's why we have more things from the late 80s, thanks to mostly to two people, Zaven Khachikian, who was probably one of the most important photographers in Armenia at that time, not just the artistic field, but he documented all the protests and during the Karabakh War. So he had this major photographic work. And then we had Aram Urutian, who was different profile, who was an amateur photographer who had a job, different day job, but who loved this group of artists. And he had a camera and just was documenting what they were doing just because he liked to spend time with them. But there was not intentional desire to not show, not document. However, they didn't care much about that either. I mean, in general, when I'm speaking about them, it's always hard. They're always happy to speak with me, but they want to speak about other things. They don't want to necessarily go back and document. There's not that sense of history, documentation, dates. When I ask these artists, oh, can you just check dates and names? And it's like, oh, that doesn't matter. It's not important. So, but not intentional act of not showing.
So thank you.
So we have to find it kind of against this sort of force of history. For them, their art was not grounded in history nor into a geographic zone. I mean, they speak also a lot of international art, like not sort of country specific or anything.
Also, people ask to share the name of the podcast that you mentioned again. But again, we will post this video and it will be available to the public.
Sure. I don't know if I can put it in the Q&A, but I'm going to put it in the chat. So if Katerina can put it in the Q&A so everybody has it. So it's a link where you can find the part that is called anthology. So there's an image and sometimes a small description of the performance. And you have also a section called podcast and articles. And in the podcast, you have a lot of interviews there.
And what drew you to research on performance art, Armenian performance art?
So it was a little bit by chance. So when you specialize in modern contemporary art, of course, you kind of cross paths with performance, although it was not my main field of study, but just part of what the artist I was working on did. For Armenian performance, it came when I was working on the Djavadian collection that was shown at the National Gallery of Armenia a couple of years ago. And when I was doing archival research, I found in the collector's archive all those photographs made by Ara Murutian. So I decided to interview him about it. And so when we were discussing, at some point he just mentioned that he had filmed this 88 collective performance of the third floor with the living dead. I said, no way, that's not possible. Nobody knows about it. Nobody has seen it. If something existed, we would know because it's the most famous performance. And so I said, no, I'm sure I did it, but nobody knew about it. So I said, can you find it? So he looked for months, couldn't find it, remembered that actually the film was still in the camera he used. And so he had donated that camera to a friend. The friend had died. So for me, it was a mission impossible to just find anything. But at some day, he just saw the children of that friend who were just trashing their father's stuff. And he said, can you make sure if there's such a camera, they might, the tape must be, I mean, the film must be still inside. So actually it was. I can't believe that for several decades, the film was stayed in the camera. And so we preserved it. I got it digitalized. So that's how I started researching that performance. And because I found that footage, I thought, okay, that's kind of my duty to not just sit on it. I mean, I need to do something. So I started going around in different countries, interviewing all the artists about how the idea came in, how they did the performance, why I asked the same questions to make a little documentary film. And so all the other research I did, and with also Ruben Arefshetian, was shown in December at the ICA in Yerevan. So that's how I came across that and got more and more interested. Also because I got digitalized recently, the Arates VHS, so just things came out. And discussing also with Marine Karayan for the anthology, she asked me to send her some material, so I had to just look into that. So one thing led to another.
Yes, and this leads me to my final question for today. What for those who are researching underdocumented and overlooked art histories, what advice and guidance would you offer? Especially, kind of working with limited archival materials, dispersed materials, discovered, like materials that are yet to be discovered, etc.
So I would say the first thing is to go to the artist and just try to ask questions. I mean, Interviews with artists adds its own limits as well. I've noticed that sometimes they just, of course, they mix dates, places, they have their own perspective, but it gives you a starting point on where to look at. For instance, if the artist mentions this other friend who was there, well, I would just go and interview that other friend about the same event. And if there are other names mentioned, I would just try to interview all the people who sort of either participated or witnessed the event. So this is always what I do when I'm researching one specific work. Just interview anybody around it and just cross the information. So finding archive is really hard because people don't necessarily do it. Some people, if you ask, they will find. Another source is Facebook. So basically, I'm on Instagram. I mean, as anybody of my generation, I'm into Instagram. But recently, I created my Facebook account because a lot of Armenians use Facebook, especially Armenian artists of a certain generation, the 80s generation. And over the last few years, they have posted some archival photos. So be careful. Their captions are not always right. They mix dates, places, etc. But it can also give you a starting point. Oh, maybe they have that material. So I have used some of the stuff I found on Facebook for this today's presentation. That's another informal way to find the material. Very rarely you find material on YouTube. It's much more rare. Also, don't neglect people who are outside the box. I know, for instance, for the Third Float group, most people just go to Nazaret Karoyan and Arman Grigoryan, and for the right reasons. But there are so many people a little bit outside that circle who may have things. And as I said, I found this film footage in the most unexpected way. Also, I think a lot of people neglected Ara Murutian as a potential source because his practice as an amateur photographer only lasted a decade, and then he moved into other things. So everybody knows him now as a graphic designer, and don't think that he may have that kind of things. And I also try to reach out, for instance, some people, a person who participated in the Arates performance was just a 17-year-old girl who participated in that, but then moved away from the art world. But she had some information and a few photos, for instance. So don't neglect also all the people around. And now you have one thing that is easy is to have social networks. So you can also track down people, find them, which is also a good way to work because especially for those people who were not in the art world anymore, you can just sometimes find them on social media.
Oh, thank you so very much, Choghakate, for this wonderful presentation and insightful Q&A session. My big thanks to everyone who attended to today's lecture. Again, it will be eventually online. So we hope to see you at our next events. And in the museum, please check our website most events are possible to attend in person and also virtually. Thank you very much.